Maya Chen had mastered the art of being invisible, and it wasn't something she was particularly proud of, but it was a survival skill she'd perfected over 23 years of life in a world that felt too loud, too fast, too demanding for someone like her. She'd been working at the Meridian for exactly 8 months, an upscale restaurant in downtown Seattle, where the clientele wore watches that cost more than her annual rent, and the wine list required a sommelier with an actual degree. And in those 8 months she'd spoken maybe 100 words total to her co-workers beyond the absolute necessities of taking orders and coordinating with the kitchen staff. The other servers called her the ghost, though never to her face, because Maya had a way of disappearing into corners, into shadows, into the background noise of clinking silverware and murmured conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes in the San Juan Islands. Her manager, a perpetually stressed woman named Caroline who chewed through pencils like they were candy, had hired Maya specifically because she was desperate, and Maya had showed up to the interview on time with clean clothes and references that actually checked out, which apparently put her in the top 10% of applicants. But Caroline had pulled her aside after the first week and said in that tone that people use when they're trying to be encouraging but are actually just pointing out your fundamental inadequacy as a human being, that maybe Maya should try to smile more, engage with the customers more, be more personable, because this wasn't just any restaurant, this was the Meridian, and their clients expected a certain level of service that went beyond just bringing food from point A to point B. Maya had nodded and said she'd try, which was what she always said, and then she'd gone right back to being exactly who she was, because changing yourself wasn't like flipping a switch, no matter how many self-help books suggested otherwise. And she'd read plenty of them, a whole stack on her bedside table with titles like Break Free from Social Anxiety and The Confidence Code, that she'd bought with tip money and read cover to cover while taking notes in the margins, like they were textbook. But knowing what you should do and actually doing it were two entirely different continents separated by an ocean of fear that felt impossible to cross. The truth was that Maya had always been this way, the quiet kid in school who ate lunch in the library, and the teenager who'd rather die than give a presentation in front of the class, the college student who'd dropped out after one semester because the thought of walking into a lecture hall full of strangers made her physically ill, and now she was the adult version of all those earlier iterations, still carrying the same weight of inadequacy, but now with bills to pay and rent due on the first of every month, regardless of whether she felt capable of facing the world or not. Her apartment was a studio in the International District, 4th floor walk-up with a radiator that clanked like someone was inside it, with a hammer and a view of a brick wall, exactly 8 feet away from her single window. But it was hers, the first place she'd ever lived alone, and that meant something, even if the loneliness sometimes felt like a physical presence in the room with her, a companion she hadn't asked for but couldn't seem to shake. It was a Tuesday afternoon during the dead zone between lunch and dinner, when the restaurant was mostly empty, except for a few lingering business people, nursing coffee and checking their phones, that Maya noticed the woman sitting alone in booth 7 by the window, overlooking 5th Avenue. She was older, maybe 70 or 75, with silver hair styled in that way that required both money and a standing appointment at an expensive salon, wearing a navy blue dress that probably cost more than Maya's car if Maya had owned a car, which she didn't, because public transportation was cheaper and parking in Seattle was basically extortion. And there was something about the way she was sitting, very still and very straight, that caught Maya's attention in a way that most customers didn't. Maya had been assigned to her section, which meant she had to approach the table, had to do the whole greeting routine that felt like putting on a mask of someone more competent and comfortable, and she walked over with her notepad clutched in front of her like a shield, mentally rehearsing the words she'd say, the same words she'd said 1,000 times before, but still had to consciously prepare for like an actor before going on stage. The woman looked up when Maya approached and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and Maya opened her mouth to launch into her greeting when the woman started making hand gestures, deliberate movements that Maya recognized immediately, because this was the one thing, the single solitary thing in her entire anxiety-ridden existence that she was actually good at, actually confident about, the one skill she possessed that felt like a superpower in a life otherwise devoid of anything special. The woman was signing in American Sign Language, and she was asking if anyone here could understand her, if there was someone who could help her order, and without thinking, without the usual 3-second delay, where Maya's brain screamed at her to stop and consider all the ways this could go wrong, Maya's hands moved in response, fluid and confident in a way her voice never was, signing back that yes, she could help. She understood perfectly, and the transformation on the woman's face was immediate and profound, like someone had turned on a light inside her, whole expression shifting from resignation to surprise, to something that looked suspiciously like tears threatening to spill over. The woman's name was Eleanor Westbrook, and she'd been deaf since birth, had spent 73 years navigating a hearing world that often forgot she existed or treated her like she was stupid because she couldn't hear. And she'd come to the Meridian because her son was supposed to meet her here for lunch, but he'd been delayed at a meeting and texted to say he'd be late, and she'd been sitting here for 20 minutes watching servers walk past, trying to flag someone down, but they all seemed too busy or too uncomfortable to deal with someone who couldn't just shout her order across the room like everyone else. What happened next was something Maya would remember for the rest of her life as the moment when everything that came after became possible. Because Eleanor didn't just order lunch and move on, she asked Maya to sit down if she had a moment, and Maya knew she absolutely shouldn't, knew that Caroline would appear from the kitchen at any second, with that look on her face that said, "We don't pay you to socialize with customers," but she sat anyway, because Eleanor's eyes had that look that Maya recognized from her own mirror, the look of someone who'd been invisible for so long that being seen felt like oxygen after holding your breath underwater. They talked in sign language, hands moving in that beautiful, efficient way that always felt more natural to Maya than spoken words ever had, and Eleanor asked her where she'd learned to sign, and Maya explained that her younger brother Daniel had been born deaf, that she'd grown up with ASL as her second language, that it was the one thing in her childhood that felt like a gift instead of a burden, because while she struggled to speak to hearing people, struggled to make eye contact and small talk and all the things that came naturally to everyone else, with Daniel and his friends in the deaf community, she'd always felt at ease, felt like herself, felt like the words that flowed from her hands were more honest than anything that ever came out of her mouth. Eleanor listened with the kind of attention that Maya rarely experienced, the kind where you could tell someone was actually hearing you instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. And then Eleanor told her own story, about growing up in the 50s and 60s when deaf children were often institutionalized or hidden away, about fighting for her education and her independence, about building a life that people told her she couldn't have, about marrying a man who learned sign language before he even proposed because he wanted to court her properly, about raising a son who was hearing but bilingual, who'd grown up understanding that there were different ways to communicate and none of them were better or worse than the others, just different. The conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like something shifted in the universe during those 20 minutes, like two people who'd been walking parallel paths, suddenly discovered they'd been heading to the same destination all along, and when Eleanor's son finally arrived, rushing in with his tie loosened and his phone still in his hand and apologies falling from his lip, he stopped short when he saw his mother and Maya sitting together, hands flying, both of them laughing at something Eleanor had signed about a waiter she'd encountered in Paris, who'd tried to communicate with her, using nothing but exaggerated facial expressions and wild gestures that made him look like he was being attacked by invisible bees. James Westbrook had built his fortune in tech, one of those stories that sounded fake when you heard it summarized. Kid from Seattle starts a software company in his garage at 22 and sells it for $800 million before he's 30, then takes that money and builds an investment firm that turns every company it touches into gold, and now at 38 he was worth somewhere north of $3 billion depending on which magazine you asked, and what the stock market was doing on any given day. But standing in the Meridian watching his mother communicate with a young waitress in sign language, he felt like he was seeing something that all his money couldn't buy, and wouldn't know how to value if it could. He knew exactly 4 people outside his family who could sign with his mother, 4 people in his entire social circle of hundreds who'd bothered to learn ESL well enough to have an actual conversation, and 3 of those 4 were people he paid to know it, his mother's interpreter, and 2 assistants who facilitated her meetings and appointments, and the 4th was his ex-fiancée, Rebecca, who'd learned the basics during their relationship, but never got comfortable enough to do more than sign simple greetings and pleasantries before switching back to having James translate. He watched his mother's face as she signed with this waitress whose name tag read, Maya in simple block letters, and he realized he hadn't seen his mother look that animated, that engaged, that genuinely happy in months, maybe years, because despite all the accommodations money could buy, despite the interpreters and the technology and the carefully planned logistics that surrounded her life, his mother was fundamentally lonely in a way that James had never quite figured out how to fix. Maya stood up when she noticed him, her whole demeanor changing instantly from open and expressive to closed and guarded, her shoulders hunching slightly, her eyes dropping to the floor, and she signed something quick to his mother, before starting to back away from the table with a stammered apology that she needed to check on her other tables. But Eleanor caught her hand and held it for just a moment, signing thank you with such genuine emotion that Maya's eyes went shining, and then she was gone, disappearing toward the kitchen with that particular speed walk that service workers perfect when they're trying to look busy. James slid into the booth across from his mother and signed his apologies for being late, but Eleanor waved them away and signed back with enthusiasm about the remarkable young woman who'd just left, about how rare it was to find someone who signed so fluently and naturally, about how Maya had told her she'd learned from her brother, about how they'd talked about everything from Eleanor's foundation work to Maya's favorite books, and wasn't it wonderful that in a city of millions you could still stumble into these unexpected moments of connection. 3 years passed, and Maya's life changed in ways that were both dramatic and subtle, the kind of transformation that happens so gradually you don't notice it until you look back and realize you're standing in a completely different place than where you started. Eleanor Westbrook had left her a business card that day, with a handwritten note that said, "If you ever need anything at all," and Maya had tucked it into her wallet, where it stayed for 6 months before she finally worked up the courage to use it, not because she needed money or a favor, but because Eleanor had mentioned she volunteered with a non-profit that provided resources for deaf children and their families, and Maya had been thinking about Daniel, about how hard their parents had struggled to find the right support when he was young, and maybe she could help somehow, could volunteer, could do something useful with the one skill she actually possessed. That initial email led to a volunteer position, which led to a part-time job coordinating family resources, which led to Maya discovering she was actually good at this, good at helping people navigate systems and find resources, and connect families who felt isolated with communities that understood their experience, and the work was mostly done through email and carefully written documentation which suited her perfectly, because she could edit and revise and make sure everything she said came out right instead of stumbling through spoken conversations. She was still working at the Meridian on weekends, because the tips were too good to give up entirely, and she needed the money to pay for the online courses she'd started taking, business administration and non-profit management, trying to build towards something more stable than just scraping by paycheck to paycheck. Eleanor had become something like a mentor, or maybe a fairy godmother, checking in regularly, inviting Maya to foundation events where she'd stand in the corner feeling awkward but gradually less terrified, and Eleanor introduced her to people who could help her career, who could offer advice, who could open doors that Maya didn't even know existed, and slowly, painfully slowly, Maya started to believe that maybe she wasn't fundamentally broken, maybe she was just wired different, maybe there was a version of success that didn't require her to become someone she wasn't. She'd started therapy too, actual professional help instead of just self-help books, and her therapist Dr. Singh had helped her understand that social anxiety wasn't a character flaw, it was a condition that could be managed with the right tools and strategies, and a lot of patient work. And while Maya still felt that clench of fear in her chest when she had to speak in front of people, still struggled with phone calls and unexpected social situations, she'd developed coping mechanisms that made life feel less like a constant battle against her own nervous system. James Westbrook's dating life was a disaster, and his mother wouldn't stop reminding him of this fact. Every single time they had coffee, which was every Sunday morning at her house in Madison Park, a ritual they'd maintained since his father died 5 years ago, and this particular Sunday Eleanor was being more persistent than usual about her newest scheme, which was setting James up on a blind date with someone she knew through the foundation. James was signing back that absolutely not, he didn't do blind date, he barely did regular dates anymore after Rebecca had ended their engagement 2 years ago, because she'd finally admitted that being with him meant living in a fishbowl, meant having every restaurant meal interrupted by people who wanted to pitch him ideas or ask for investment advice or just touch the hem of his suit jacket, like he was some kind of prosperity Buddha who'd rub off on them if they got close enough. And she'd decided she wanted a normal life with a normal person who didn't require a security consultation before attending a movie premiere. Eleanor had been disappointed by Rebecca's departure, but not surprised, and she'd told James at the time that Rebecca was a lovely woman but not the right woman, and James had asked what the hell that meant because Rebecca had been smart and beautiful, and came from a good family and they'd had plenty in common, and Eleanor had signed back with that particular expression. Mothers get when they're about to say something their children won't want to hear that Rebecca had never really seen him, had been in love with the idea of who he was supposed to be rather than who he actually was underneath all the money and prestige and public persona. James had dismissed this at the time as his mother being overprotective and maybe a little jealous of losing her son's attention, but in the 2 years since he'd started to wonder if Eleanor had been right because he'd dated 7 women in that time, all of them perfectly acceptable on paper, and every single relationship had followed the same trajectory. Initial excitement followed by the gradual realization that they were performing their expected roles in a script someone else had written rather than actually connecting as human beings who understood each other. So he didn't want to go on a blind date with whoever Eleanor had decided was perfect for him this time, but his mother had that look in her eye, that determination that he'd learned to recognize as unstoppable. And she signed that this woman was different, this woman was special, this woman had shown her more kindness in 20 minutes than most people showed in a lifetime, and would it kill him to have one dinner, just one single dinner? What was the worst that could happen, except he'd lose 2 hours of his life, and maybe have a pleasant conversation over expensive food. Maya had changed outfits 4 times before settling on a navy blue dress that Eleanor had helped her pick out during a shopping trip that had felt like a bizarre dream where she was suddenly the protagonist of a romantic comedy instead of the background extra she'd always been, and now she was standing outside Canlis, which was only the most expensive and exclusive restaurant in Seattle, the kind of place where you needed reservations 6 months in advance, unless you were the kind of person who had people to make those things happen with a single phone call, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone, which kept buzzing with encouraging texts from Eleanor that said things like, "You're going to be wonderful, and just be yourself," which was advice that Maya found simultaneously touching and completely unhelpful, because being herself was exactly what she was afraid of. She'd known this was a setup from the moment Eleanor had suggested it 3 weeks ago, had known that the mysterious dinner companion was Eleanor's son, had actually looked him up online and nearly fainted when she saw exactly who James Westbrook was, which explained the house in Madison Park and the chauffeur-driven car, and the casual way Eleanor donated money to causes in amounts that made Maya's annual salary look like pocket change, and Maya had tried to back out at least 5 times, but Eleanor had been gently insistent, had assured her that James didn't know who she was either, that this was just 2 people having dinner, nothing more, nothing less. No pressure, no expectations. Maya walked through the door, because turning around and running away would be even more humiliating than whatever awkward disaster was about to unfold, and the hostess greeted her with that particular professional warmth that expensive restaurants cultivate and asked if she was meeting someone, and Maya managed to whisper James Westbrook's name, without her voice cracking too badly, and then she was being led through the restaurant toward a table by the window, with a view of Lake Union spread out below, like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet, and there he was, the man from 3 years ago who'd stood in the Meridian watching his mother sign with a stranger, and he looked different somehow, older maybe, or more tired, and he stood when he saw her approaching, and his expression went through a complex series of changes, confusion, recognition, surprise, something else that might have been pleasure, or might have been Maya's desperate imagination trying to make this situation less terrifying than it was. The first words out of James's mouth were, "You're Maya from the Meridian," which wasn't a question but a statement of absolute recognition, and Maya nodded and started to apologize for not realizing Eleanor had meant him when she'd said her son, but James was laughing, actually laughing in a way that seemed to surprise him, as much as it surprised Maya, and he said he couldn't believe his mother had actually pulled this off because she'd been scheming to get them in the same room for 3 years, but he'd always been traveling, or in meetings, or deliberately avoiding her matchmaking attempts. And wasn't it just like Eleanor to finally succeed by not telling either of them who they were meeting? They sat down, and the awkwardness that Maya had been dreading never quite materialized because James started signing as he spoke, seamlessly moving between both languages in that way that only truly bilingual people can, and it shifted something in Maya's chest, loosened some knot of tension she'd been carrying since she walked through the door, because this was someone who understood that communication came in different forms and none of them were less valid than others. They talked about Eleanor first, trading stories about her determination and her kindness and her absolutely ruthless approach to helping people whether they wanted help or not. And James told Maya about how his mother had been talking about her constantly for 3 years, the remarkable young woman from the restaurant who'd made her feel seen, who'd gone on to work for the foundation, who was doing such important work connecting families with resources, and Maya was shocked to learn that James had been hearing about her this whole time, while she'd only learned his name 3 weeks ago when Eleanor had finally admitted who she was setting her up with. The conversation flowed in a way that Maya had never experienced on a date before, probably because she'd only been on maybe 4 actual dates in her entire life, and all of them had been excruciating exercises in trying to be someone she wasn't. But with James there was no performance, no pretense. He asked about her work and actually listened to the answer. Asked about her brother and her family and how she'd ended up in Seattle, and he talked about his own life, not in that humble bragging way that rich people often did, but with genuine reflection on how strange and surreal it was to have more money than he could spend in 5 lifetimes while still feeling fundamentally uncertain about what he was supposed to be doing with his life beyond making more money. 3 hours passed like 30 minutes and their food sat half-eaten, because they were too busy talking to remember to actually consume anything. And when the waiter brought the check, James took it without that performance some men made of fighting over who pays, just handled it like it was the least important part of the evening. And then he asked if Maya wanted to walk along the waterfront, because he wasn't ready for the night to end, and Maya found herself saying yes before her anxiety could construct reasons why this was a terrible idea. They walked along Lake Union with the city lights reflected in the dark water, and James told her about his mother's reaction when he'd come home that day 3 years ago, how Eleanor had declared that Maya was special, that there was something about her that reminded Eleanor of herself at that age, fighting to be seen in a world that would rather she stay invisible. And James admitted that he'd thought about Maya sometimes over those 3 years, wondered what happened to the shy waitress who could sign so beautifully, who'd made his mother laugh in a way he rarely witnessed anymore. And now here they were walking beside the water like the universe had been working on this moment all along, and they'd just been too distracted to notice it coming together.